My name is Vidima. I am a sophomore at Columbia and current president of Hindu YUVA. And this is actually our first event of the year, so mental health from a Hindu perspective. And as everyone probably knows from the information, today we have with us here Dr. Neil Agarwal, who will be leading the session. So let me start off by sharing a bit of background with all of you about Dr. Neil Agarwal. So Neil Krishnan Agarwal is an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia and a research psychiatrist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. His areas of interest are cultural psychiatry, cultural competence training, and psychiatric anthropology. He is especially interested in conceptions of mental health and illness among South Asian and Middle Eastern populations. He went to medical school at Case Western Reserve University, studied cultural psychiatry and medical anthropology at Harvard, and trained at Yale University, and is now at Columbia. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us today, Dr. Agarwal. And just to everyone here, a little bit more info is that, like I mentioned, please have your cameras on if you can. This is going to be an interactive session, where we all get to participate and ask questions throughout the session. So if you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and directly ask Neilji. Or you can even, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can actually type it in the chat box, and either Wishwajit or I will basically just ask them on your behalf. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to our speaker today.
So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. You guys can call me Neil. I have a few ground rules that I'd like to get started with. The first is that even though we're talking about mental health from a Hindu perspective today, I'd encourage everyone to recognize that this is actually not a forum to discuss any kind of personal mental health matters. And the reason why is because you all are university students, and at the university we take that very seriously. So I happen to be in a profession where, because many people assume that we're going to be talking about mental health, that perhaps they want to discuss any specific issues that they might be experiencing. And I want to discourage anybody from that. It's not because I am insensitive or because I don't want to hear about problems in general. It's because whenever we talk about specific individual problems, then we're establishing a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not the forum to do that. And in fact, Columbia University has great mental health resources for all of you or everybody in the Columbia University community, in case you feel like you would like to access those. I teach in the Committee on Global Thought through the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and so I'm quite aware of the extensive resources that Columbia can offer in case you have any kind of specific questions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that this is kind of veering into family time for me. So if you see my little kids running in, then you might see me try to reprimand them to avoid the Zoom talk. But everybody at home knows that from 4 to 5 that this is protected for Hindu YUVA. So please forgive me in advance if there are any interruptions to that end. And then I think the final thing I'd like to talk to you about, or at least to frame this discussion around, is that I am going to be talking to you about what I consider to be my engagement with Bhagavad Gita based on what Vishwajit had recommended as a topic for discussion. This is not intended to be a scholarly talk, or certainly not a talk from a secular Euro-American framework. Columbia has been in the news, both within higher education in the United States as well as in India, for several kinds of contentious arguments around funding for Hindu studies and who gets to say what about Hindu studies. And I don't want to address any of that today. I think that's very important, particularly when we talk about representation, who gets to say what about what religious tradition and who doesn't. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be really talking about the Gita, and that would be the basis for our talk today. So with that in mind, Viswajit asked me to say a few words about what I particularly find attractive of the Gita, or about the Gita. And I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. So please don't restrict this conversation just to me. And I think I'd like to address this talk today first by really starting to discuss my engagements with the Gita as an adherent, because as someone who does describe myself as a practicing Hindu, I find that the Gita has very interesting insights into how mental health is not just conceptualized, but also practiced on a day-to-day basis. And some of you who might have been exposed to forms of psychology like mindfulness or mindfulness-based approaches to psychology may be familiar with this. I'm going to try to do something, which is look at the participants and see if you guys could perhaps indicate by, say, hand claps, how many people on this talk today are familiar with mindfulness, meditation, or mindfulness-based approaches? Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, quite a few of you. That's great. That's really great. So I practice mindfulness as a Hindu in terms of meditation, and I also teach it formally to my patients within a secular psychological framework in my practice. And there are several things from the Gita that I think are pretty interesting that we can talk about. And what I'm going to try to do is post this in the chat right here. Let me know if you can, if one of you can show your hand clap. Let me know if you see this in the chat. Great, very good. So there are plenty of verses in the Gita we could discuss as a community of Hindus, but the kinds of verses that I typically gravitate to happen to be the ones that are very Vedantic from a philosophical perspective, that also start to interrogate the relationship between ourselves, or like our sense of identity, and the kinds of emotions that we experience. And so, for example, if you see chapter 12, verse 15, the translation here is, he by whom the world is not agitated and whom the world cannot agitate. He who remains calm in times of joy, anger, fear, and anxiety is dear to me. Now, as a psychiatrist and as a cultural psychiatrist, when we're talking about cultural models of emotions, of the self, of how the self experiences emotions, I find this to be very, very interesting. And there are commentarial traditions that expand upon this idea where the he here, and we can say she or they for more gender inclusive language, that the individual is someone who is not necessarily identified with the emotion that he, she, or they is experiencing at any given moment. And I think that's really, really consonant with what we talk about with mindfulness training in mental health. So for example, when I'm sitting with patients in my practice and we're talking about experiencing really strong emotions, and whether that's anger or anxiety or fear, that this is a really, really powerful way of getting people within practice to understand that just because they experience a really strong and intense feeling, that doesn't mean that they have to identify with it. And that's not a message that many people, particularly I think in the contexts that I've grown up in, are used to hearing. Like for example, you know, quite familiar with how in English we say, I am happy, or I am sad, or I am depressed, I'm angry. And there's been some pretty interesting psychiatric anthropology work and cultural psychiatry work about how, at least in secular Euro-American context, when I say secular, I mean where religion is no longer as prevalent in society because it's a separation of religion from politics and therefore social space, about how that basic equation, I am sad, I am depressed, I am angry, I am X as an emotion, posits an equivalence between who I am as an identity and what I'm feeling in an emotional state. And mindfulness militates against that idea. And the fact that the Gita includes ideas like this, where our identity or who we think of as ourselves is not the same as the emotions that we experience, I think speaks to a common root of practice and of theory between some of the ideas about the self in the Gita and some concepts of mindfulness that we now are starting to take for granted in mental health because they're so widespread and popular. Does that make sense to people? I only see like half of the people's cameras up. So I can't quite tell about the other people who don't have their cameras on, but even if you don't have your cameras on, that's totally okay. If you have any questions, let's take about 10 or 15 seconds and give some time for people to enter any kind of questions or any kind of feedback in the chat. Okay, so I'll take a few moments right now and I'll be silent as I look for things in the chat, and then Vidima or Vishwajiji can talk about whether they want to field them now or toward the end. Wow, that's a very good. So I think there's somebody named, is it Sarthak on the chat? Has asked a very, very excellent question. Okay, which is how do we move from theory to implementation of the principles? We can talk about that. That's an excellent question. Are there aspects of secular psychology that contradict what you read in the Gita? Yes, many, and we can talk about that as well. That's actually the easiest one to talk about. Okay, so why don't we start with these two questions first? If it's all right with our Hindu YUVA moderators, I'll take the second one before the first. So I think that some aspects of secular psychology that contradict what I read in the Gita is the idea that, well, are many. So let's talk about some of them, which are that when we talk about what I call secular psychology, or if you were taking one of my classes, either in the Department of Psychiatry or at the Community on Global Thought, I'd have you read a bunch of classical social theorists, whether it's Sigmund Freud or Michel Foucault or Carl Jung, or people who we typically think of as the bedrock of now common social science. Right? Marx, Weber, Durkheim in particular for sociology and anthropology, Freud, Jung, Nietzsche. And some of the aspects that we see in secular psychology are the idea, first of all, that secularism entails that there isn't space really for divinity in this way, right? Because the notion of secular psychology is that what we see, what we grasp, or at least in the Gita, what we talk about, the five, the indriyas, the five senses, is all that our reality can apprehend at any given moment. The Gita fairly robustly, I think, contradicts that, because there's a whole aspect around reincarnation. There's a whole aspect around a relationship to God that secular psychology is either neutral toward, or certainly in more orthodox schools of psychology or psychiatry is actually hostile to. So you can read the works of Sigmund Freud, who really talks about how religion is just like a psychological defense mechanism for people who have weak ego structures. And in that, it's pretty clear that the kind of conception of psychology that he's advancing is contradictory to what we read in the Gita. There's another great question. Do you find any gaps in secular versus religious psychology that the other can potentially fill? Okay, that's an excellent question too. So we'll try to get to that question, I think, hopefully as a group, because I think that's a really great point that we can discuss together. I think some other things that we typically think about in the Gita that maybe depart a little bit from Govind's question is that when we talk about the doctor-patient relationship, you'll see a lot of Indian psychiatrists and talking about how the antecedents of the doctor-patient relationship can really be found in the dialogue between Arjuna and Lord Krishna, which which is like a nice analogy, but it's not in any kind of professional context valid, right? No psychiatrist or psychologist should be holding themselves up to be as omniscient or omnipotent as Lord Krishna, right? There's a clear bounded structure to what psychiatrists or psychologists can or cannot do. And there's certainly not the kind of dynamic that Arjun projects onto Lord Krishna about being all-knowing or certainly all capable that the psychiatrist or psychologist should accept. The reason why is because so much of contemporary secular psychology is how does the individual in front of us kind of find their own goals and live out their own truth, and how do they figure out for themselves how to resolve their own conflicts. And the psychiatrist and the psychologist will show a mirror to the person based on certain kinds of theories, but it's up to the individual to really do the hard work of analyzing with the mental health professional what's important to him or her or them. And I think the message in the Gita is different, right? I mean, we have an idea of dharma and of karma, and it's much more laid out in a prescriptive way about what one can or should be doing at any given point in time. And so it's not as individually derived as what a secular psychological framework would otherwise have. I'm going to look at, so those are just a couple of distinctions between the secular framework as we practice and think about it and say aspects of the Gita. I see Vadima's question is, from reading the Gita, the one principle that really stood out to me was the idea of action without attachment. Yeah, how maybe we implement this in daily life? How would it be useful? And what are my thoughts on this? Okay, so we're kind of getting to the some of the more, I think, metaphysical and like spiritual aspects of this. I'm sure all of you know, or many of you probably know this verse, right? I mean, when I was growing up, and it's part of like my puja every day, this is a hard mantra to recite and to like really, really like believe. Karmanya vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, right? It's a person has the right toward action alone and not toward the fruit of action. Now let's talk about, I think, some principles of practice and action that you all might find helpful, okay? And again, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and we are only doing this for the purposes of illustration and what we would say in mental health, psychoeducation, right? But you want to bring this into action? Like, can I tell you how I do this? Would that be all right with all of you? And again, it's not for a prescriptive practice for anybody in establishing a doctor-patient relationship, but really to show you how I think about this. And I see this as a way of melding what we talk about with mindfulness with approaches from the Gita. Here is a mnemonic, RAIN, that I often help kind of organize my practice around and what many of my patients find helpful, right? And I'm going to type out what it means. And this is my 4-step brief way of communicating to you how I see principles of the Gita brought into my life. And it's very difficult, and I'm not assuming whatsoever that it's easy to do. I'm certainly not contending that. But what I see consistent between the Gita and what we see in mindfulness-based approaches within psychiatry and psychology is the idea of what we call recognizing strong emotions, accepting that they exist, interrogating the validity, veracity of them, and then non-identifying with them, which means how do we cultivate a psychological space between what we're experiencing emotionally at any given moment and who we think we are and what our goals of life should be. Okay, so let's go through an example. I'll give you an example that just happened today, if that's all right, okay? Which is that as a physician, I have to send bills to people, right? So if you've ever gone to a physician and you see what's called a CPT code, or common procedure terminology code, it lets the insurance company know how much or what was actually done in a meeting with the doctor and what the procedure should be billed for. Now, as a small business owner and a physician in private practice in New York City, like many small business owners, I'm going through a decrease in my revenue because of COVID. So I saw from my e-prescribing software today that I am now being charged for CPT codes for the first time in 10 years in a way that I've never been charged before. So my business will now incur an expense that my e-prescribing software is saying I have to pay every single year now, that I never had to pay. And this being my 10th year of practice, it's never come to my attention. So I started to immediately feel anxiety because I don't like spending more money in my small business than I have to. And if you're like me, or if I am like many other people, that anxiety can start to feel really uncomfortable. Like, oh my God, I've got to cut this check. Like when I talk to my friends who are also in practice, they're not having to now pay for this. Why am I getting this email? Why is nobody else getting this email? Like, what if expenses continue to escalate? What if I'm not going to get patients now because of COVID? Now that there is a lockdown in New York and I'm potentially going to experience this this decreased revenue, then what does this mean for my overall billings? Then how does this influence or take what I take home at the end of the year, my taxes, so on and so forth, right? So it can become very easy to get lost in like this whirlwind of emotion, right? Because it cascades, right? So then I have to start thinking to myself, okay, now, since I help many of my patients go through these really, really strong, uncomfortable, powerful emotions without identifying with them, how do I implement this in my life? So recognizing, for example, is, okay, appreciating that there's a strong emotion that exists. What is that emotion? Well, for me, it's anxiety, it's annoyance, it's frustration, it's a little bit of irritability, okay? Why do we call that recognition? Because we believe in mindfulness that unless you actually know what's going on with you, unless you can really appreciate the emotional experience you're having in that moment, then you can't really get to that path of self-knowledge, right? And in Hinduism, we talk about this quite regularly, right? Swadhyay, like knowledge of, or studying oneself, right, is really, really based on this idea of self-knowledge, right? Like the Gita is full of references to like the Sanskrit root dhyana, right? And like concentration, awareness is a way of thinking about it. So recognizing that one is experiencing a strong emotion, right, is the key to the first step of what I consider to be a way of putting this into practice. And it's important to be able to recognize it and say, okay, this is what's happening to me, because then as opposed to just experiencing the emotion, you can now critically reflect on the emotion that you're experiencing without having to take it for granted. That gets into the next step, which is accepting, which is, okay, now that I've experienced this emotion, how do I allow myself to just sit in that really, really difficult, strong space, right? How do I allow myself to say, okay, I'm experiencing anxiety, I'm experiencing annoyance, I'm experiencing irritability. If I don't pay this, then I could be potentially audited by an insurance company and taken to court and all the legal ramifications that come about. I don't want to go through that. That's an uncomfortable experience. At the same time, if I do pay this, it's just money from my pocket, and it's not, and money's an attachment. And we know that the Gita talks about how we shouldn't be attached to things, right? So how do I get to the point where I can be comfortable with experiencing the strong emotion without pushing it away, as opposed to saying, okay, let me just turn Netflix on, or let me go talk to a friend, let me go take a walk and try to bury this without allowing myself to talk about the alternatives. The alternatives part is interrogation, which is, am I allowing myself to think about the situation with all the possible data that I have, right? Can I interrogate, can I critically reflect on the first order emotions that I've experienced to ask, is this the right way of looking at this? It's one way of looking at it, but is it the only way of looking at it? Can I bring in more information? Can I start to argue with myself to give myself a different set of alternatives? Can I start to then not, what we talk about in mental health often, can I not catastrophize, which is assuming the worst conclusion? Or can I not jump to conclusions, which is also a different type of negative reasoning? Can I avoid looking at the situation in terms of all or nothing, black or white thinking? These kinds of strategies that we often think about in mindfulness or in cognitive behavioral therapy can be really helpful in interrogating the first set of thoughts or emotions that we experience. And then non-identification is like just letting go. Okay. After I've allowed myself the various ways to reflect on what I was experiencing emotionally, to challenge the thoughts that I had initially, can I start to come to a different conclusion? Okay, so the conclusion that I've come across is that, okay, I might have to pay this money. It's not the end of the world. It's certainly not crippling to my revenue. It's annoying. It's kind of maddening that I, as a brown male, don't seem to be exempt when I talk with my friends who are white physicians. They don't have this notification. So like, why am I getting up? Why am I being identified for this? And maybe that's not the best way of looking at it. Maybe it has nothing to do with race. Maybe it has to do with just the fact that I was randomly selected or chosen for an audit, right? But if I allow myself to interrogate and draw other kinds of alternatives or conclusions, then that can be a way of challenging the first set of thoughts and emotions that I had about the experience, and then letting go, non-identifying, or what I think the Gita would say, detaching, right? If you look at the Gita, there are these verses in Sanskrit, Sangam Tyaktava. Tyaktava is having sacrificed or having let go of Sangam, the attachment, right? That these are ways, at least in mindfulness training and mental health, that we talk about letting go of attachments. So far, I know that was a lot of information. If you were like, if we were in session in psychotherapy, this itself would have covered like 50 minutes. And I breezed through this in 10 or 15 minutes with you all. But because there were so many questions about how to take this from theory into practice, and because I do this in my day-to-day life, I thought I'd share it with you. Do you have any questions for now? And if so, I'll take a few moments to allow you all to incorporate into the chat before we then open up for other discussion. Would it be helpful if you all got something in the chat about what I give to the people who I work with and what I also read for myself about how to interrogate your way of thinking? Okay, this is something, if you click on, it's called 15 Cognitive Distortions. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of psychotherapy that's among the most widely researched and tested in mental health, we talk about different ways of thinking. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be roughly thought about as thinking about your thinking, or thinking about your feelings, or thinking about your behaving, as opposed to just thinking, feeling, or behaving uncritically or without thinking about it. And so the 15 common cognitive distortions that I've put in the chat are different common ways that people end up taking emotions or thoughts and not necessarily interrogating them, but going from one set of thoughts to another in ways that are typically distorted from the evidence, or that are, when we say distorted, we talk about how they can be empirically tested through your five senses. And so this is a set of 15 common cognitive distortions that many people find helpful. So that way they can catch themselves in the act of doing something. And that can then be a way of starting to really, really interrogate and then hopefully non-identify with your initial thoughts, emotions, and situations from the outset. So,
Jump in
any
here.
thoughts or emotion, or any kinds of questions or other points of discussion that you all would like to cover before?
I wanted to interrupt here really quick. It looks like
therapy.
Yeah.
It's kind of a broad question, but does that sort of make sense? Yeah.
That's a really good question. I would say that there isn't an easy understanding of karma, at least in a metaphysical way, in my reading of the Gita, compared with Western psychology. So everybody knows that karma means actions, right? And in that sense, um, actions might seem to have an analogy with what we talk about in, say, mental, like secular models of psychiatry or psychology as behaviors, right? So when we talk about, at least when I think about psychiatry or psychology, I'm often thinking about three broad domains. They're not the exclusive domains, but three broad domains: thoughts, emotions, behaviors, right? Karma as an action implies the idea of behaviors, right? At a first level. But I think that when you talk about like karma really more according to how the Gita also defines it, are you guys familiar with the idea of vasanas or impressions from like past lives, right? And this is where there's a clear disagreement between, say, secular Euro-American psychology and the Gita. In our secular framework, we don't have this understanding of past lives or reincarnation. So it's not as if there's a soul that transmigrates and then the soul is trying to work out karmas from other lives. That just doesn't exist. And because of that, you know what? I'm going to pause that. I'm going to join again. Okay. The link, because I don't want to lose my thought. When we talk about past lives, there isn't such a framework in psychiatry or psychology. And so the idea that a soul would be working off the karma of past lives just doesn't exist. And so that's one major difference. The second major difference is that we often think about past lives as kind of depositing vasanas in our manas, you know, in the Gita, that like there are these impressions from our past lives that are with us right now and that influence how we view the world. And those can be certain kinds of habits or or certain kinds of predispositions to emotions or to certain kinds of thoughts. And in that sense, the idea of karma being just action doesn't seem to have a clear one-to-one correspondence with the way we think about the model of the mind in psychiatry or psychology. So those are differences that I can perceive in terms of talking about karma. Now, I don't have the chat anymore. So if there were any kind of questions or discussion points from before, then please enter them again.
I guess I do have another question that I was thinking about. So the one thing that I've also just realized, and maybe a lot of second-gen immigrants could also relate with the experience, but a lot of times I think that it's often difficult to communicate whether it is with first-generation immigrants about mental health, and there's a lot of stigma, especially in Asian cultures, about it. So I guess, is there anything that you can maybe speak to on that, like whether we could use the Bhagavad Gita to sort of bridge that understanding, or your thoughts on the subject just overall?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've always found it to be such a conundrum, right? That there's such a stigma among our Hindu communities because, I mean, there's some clear verses in the Gita that acknowledge just how terrible negative emotions are, right? And that people should really seek help for them, right? Here is one. Desire and anger, which are born out of passion, are insatiable and prompt man to great sin and should be recognized as enemies, right? So it's not as if the Gita is unaware about how negative emotions or strong emotions are problematic. I mean, the Gita addresses it front on. It's just that psychiatrists and psychologists didn't exist at the time that the Gita was being either written or revealed. And so there wasn't necessarily this secular framework within the medical system to address these problems. But I mean, the Gita is pretty clear that negative emotions are just bad for people and that people should really do something about that. And I mean, the good thing about, I think, being first generation or second generation. And certainly the good thing about accessing mental health care in this country is that because privacy laws are so strong, that I often, when I work with like people from like the Hindu Institute community, which is one area of my practice expertise, and where I like to do research at Columbia, that I remind people that you don't have to worry about certain kinds of issues, at least in this country, like stigma from family or friends or other people. You don't have to tell anybody that you're coming to go see a mental health professional, right? You won't necessarily go tell people if you are going to see a primary care physician and you get diagnosed with hypothyroidism, or if you're a woman experiencing an OBGYN problem, right? Or if you're a man and you're experiencing problems with, say, other kinds of, like your genital urological issues, right? In the same way, like if you want to talk about diabetes and asthma with people, you can. And if you want to talk about depression and anxiety, you can. And if you don't want to talk about it, it's totally your business. Like you don't have to share that information with anybody else. When I think a lot of the stigma ends up being self-stigma, right? That people feel embarrassed or people feel uncomfortable approaching someone. And I understand that because typically in our communities, we know that culture affects how we communicate, right? Who do we tell private things to? How do we say it? What can we feel comfortable talking about? What can we not feel comfortable talking about? Those are all elements of culture that are directly related to psychology, right? And psychiatry, because that really influences how people decide to seek care. And in that way, I often feel that if we normalize the experience, that it's okay to seek mental health, just for ourselves, not just for ourselves, but for other people who are in our in our social network, then that can be really powerful. Like sometimes when I'm hanging out with friends or people who I don't know so well, but I feel friendly towards, as a psychiatrist, I'll just say something like, maybe it's time for you to talk to someone. It's okay if you want to talk to someone. And that can be a way of getting people to start to think about the possibility that a mental health professional exists and would potentially be able to serve as a forum for healthcare for them. I think a lot of people, part of the problem also is issues with language, right? Like, I'm going to go back to the participant screen. How many people here speak a North Indian language? I don't know any South Indian languages, but if you can put your hand claps on, that way I get a sense, since so many people have their cameras off. Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, in our North Indian languages, right? Are you all familiar with the term pagal? Right? It's a really terrible way of talking about someone being kind of unstable mentally, right? I mean, we all know that for those of us who speak those languages, it means crazy or insane, right? But there isn't a way to talk about emotions in a secular way. Like we talk about dukh, but dukh is like really heavy, right? It's like almost like sorrowful, or what the dukhi hai, like he's like really sad or really really frustrated, but it has this like real like resonance around, like it has like a different resonance than say someone being clinically depressed in English, right? When you say that someone's clinically depressed in English, like you're automatically assuming that the person who's clinically depressed would be able to identify that it deserves treatment in a clinical setting. We just don't have that kind of translation in our North Indian languages. We don't have a framework linguistically to talk about these kinds of emotions in a way that normalizes the experience of help seeking in a medical framework. I think, quite frankly, I'm a big Bollywood lover. So when I see people like Deepika Padukone coming out and talking about her experiences with depression, or when I see people like Preeti Zinta talking about substance use, then I think it's awesome that they're willing to put themselves out there and to encourage people to get the help that we need, that all of us need at any given point in time in our lives. I think in India, what are there's some real disastrous effects. Are many of you from India? If you can show me your hand claps. Yeah. So, what's the hidden epidemic in India, in my opinion? All of the depression and anxiety that comes from studying for your 10th boards, right? Or your 12th boards, right? where people are hyper competitive and experiencing issues around around feeling stress and feeling like they can't have like this balance of studying and of life. And because the competition is so tough in India, then whenever I start to read papers, for example, about suicides in Bombay or in Bangalore, then it's really troubling. And I know that certain schools in India and certain mental health sectors have tried to go through kind of more public health screening to avoid the idea that that studying for your exams has to be like the end all or be all of your existence, right? And we just don't see that kind of analog in the United States. We don't have this like mass widespread social phenomenon of people studying for the SATs and or their ACTs and getting frustrated to the point of experiencing real levels of clinical depression or anxiety. Like when I did work in Goa and in Bombay, I was surprised at how whenever we set up these confidential anonymous hotlines, we would be inundated with calls when children and adolescents knew that they could call without their parents necessarily knowing, and we could organize care accordingly. I'm going to take a tangent right now. I see that Govinda wrote, clinical depression did not exist in English 150 years ago. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It didn't exist 150 years ago. But we're also talking about mental health right now, right? And like those concepts being deployed right now for our communities in the moment. And I'm hoping that ideas like clinical depression or a way of talking about mental health can be discussed in our Indian languages in a way that's less stigmatizing than what we do now. Does that make sense? Any other kinds of questions or comments or points for discussion?
I have something. Hi, my name is Brenda. I was wondering if you could speak to right now, since we're all at home and isolated in a way that I think a lot of us haven't experienced before. I would love to hear your feelings on how that has affected us as a society, and how you feel that maybe we can implement different things from either the Gita or whatever you feel to move forward from this time.
Okay, so let's I'm going to address 2 points. First, Govinda, this is not a talk about psychiatric epidemiology. So I'm not going to address certain things about Indian teens versus American teens, because I don't think that's productive or the goals of this talk. Just like suicide rates. I mean, we can have that discussion, but I don't think this is the place to do that, you know? And the easiest way of having that discussion is by doing epidemiological studies, right? So I'm certainly not trying to contend that for the purposes of scientific evidence or research that Indian teens are more depressed than American teens. What I'm telling you is that my experience as a cultural psychiatrist who does anthropological work in India has been that this is a phenomenon that I've observed in India, but I haven't observed in the US. You know, if you want to test it, then I think there are great epidemiological teams that can do that, you know, and there are great ways of employing scientific methods. But I didn't go into this kind of conversation expecting that that's the conversation we're having today, you know? I think for Brinda's point, I can't offer you any kind of opinion about, like, say, society, because I don't think that would be helpful for you all necessarily, you know? I see the issue in 2 ways, right? Like I tell many people in my practice, I understand that sheltering in place can be really difficult for people because people experience issues around depression or anxiety or substance use when they don't have those social connections. And those are real. They can't access care if they're already getting care. If they're not already getting care, then that can be really difficult to establish a new relationship, particularly when places are closed. At the same time, I see the argument from a different side as well, which is that not allowing people to make the kind of money that they need and to support their businesses or to see the people that they feel connected to, provided that it's in a safe and hygienic way, can also lead to depression and anxiety, because then people start to default on mortgages or car payments or student loans, and we don't have a good social response in that regard. I think one of the things that is really, really key to mindfulness, and I think we see some elements of that in the Gita as well, is the idea that how do we live in the present, right? How do we avoid thinking about the past in terms of regret or overinvestment with joy, meaning like, oh, I'm really sad that I did this, or I really wish my life were like this compared to the past. And at the same time, how do we avoid worrying about the future or over idealizing the future? Like, I'm worried that I'm not going to get into this graduate program, or I'm worried about the fact that I might not be able to get this job. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be concerned, right? Those concerns are natural, and in fact, in many cases, can be healthy if they spur you on to constructive action. But from a psychiatric or a psychological standpoint, we see these becoming destructive when it becomes a way that people start to feel impaired on a day-to-day basis. Like they start to have difficulties getting up out of bed, or they start to postpone and procrastinate, or they start to feel down about their future prospects, or they start to think that they don't want to hang out with people even when given the opportunity, because they've lost the joy of their life, the pleasure of their life. So those are certain kinds of common symptoms that we think about with depression or anxiety. Or with substance use, if they start to consume more alcohol or illicit or illicit substances than before. And so I think that one of the ways that we often emphasize mindfulness training for people is, how do you stay in the present? How do you do what you can do? I'm going to try. I see that it's getting dark outside, so I'm going to try to change my my background so that way I can be more visible. Give me 1 second. I'm going to get a quick tour of my house, but I'm going to put the lights on in the remaining 5 minutes that we have so I can be more visible to you all. There we go. This, by the way, is a picture. It's a painting that my wife and I bought of Lord Krishna and Lord Buddha together. I don't know if you can see this in the back right here. Whoops. There we go. But I thought it would be a nice background for our talk today. So in terms of mindfulness, it's like, how do we stay focused on the present? You know, how do we avoid the temptation to worry about the future or to regret the past? And that can be very difficult, but it's really about the idea of training, right? We don't talk about mindfulness as just a theory, right? We talk about it as a practice. And as a practice, it requires cultivation. It requires commitment, something that you have to deliberately and very diligently work toward. And so I often tell my patients, and what I find for myself is like, how do I maximize the amount of fun that I have every day outside of work? How do I program actively my fun or my relaxation? And that can be a way of forcing yourself to maybe come up with a schedule where you have to do your work, but it can also be a way of actively, not passively taking for granted, but actively focusing on what matters to you, what you like out of life, and how you can continue to find meaning, so that way you can get through this long haul without feeling the real oppression of social isolation. I mean, I was in New York for the heat of it all throughout the pandemic, and my wife and kids were with my parents in Pittsburgh. And for 3.5 days of the week, I was going to my practice and seeing people sick, and then coming back home to an empty house, driving every weekend, 7 hours one way, 7 hours the other way. It can become really oppressive, for my routine. And it's like, well, okay, how do I listen to the Bollywood or Bhangra songs that I like? How do I force myself to listen to podcasts and get up in the morning? How do you program your fun? And that's what we see pretty as a common element with cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral activation. How do you not take for granted your life and actively work towards living out the goals that you may want? I know we've got 5 minutes left, and I'll have to sign off at 5. But are there any other kinds of questions or comments or suggestions? do you all have any kind of closing remarks? Oh. Yeah, Ishwari, I appreciate your comment. I mean, there are ways of thinking about the Gita in terms of normalizing mental health practices for the South Asian community. There was a really great book that came out, or there was a really, really great article that came out by a scholar of South Asian studies named A.K. Ramanujan, known as 300 Ramayans. And it was talking about the diversity of the Ramayana across linguistic, regional, and religious traditions. I mean, we have versions of Ramayana in not just in Hinduism, but in Buddhism and Jainism. We also have tellings in the Dasam Granth and Sikhism. We have renditions in Valmiki and Tulsidas and Kamban Ramayana, right? And that became a platform for developing psychoeducation in order to get people to seek mental health practices throughout the 1990s in India. So using religious texts to normalize the idea that mental health is real and that one doesn't have to struggle through them oneself can be really, really great. Any other last moment or last minute thoughts or suggestions? Anybody else want to say anything before we sign off at 5 o'clock? What other kinds of Hindu YUVA events do you guys have coming up?
Well, for this semester, for this year, this is sort of the one event we have. We're hoping, actually, this is a great segue, because I actually wanted to extend to everyone here that's part of the Columbia community to please apply if you can to the Hindu YUVA board. We're expanding currently. I'll drop the link in the chat. And we'd love if you're part of the Columbia community and, you know, want to plan future events. Yeah. And so maybe I'll close out here. So thank you so much, Neil G. I think this was such a productive session. Like, I myself have so much to share. And I think actually I'll take this and, you know, share it with my parents as well. I think it'll be interesting for them to hear as well. And I'm sure that everyone can definitely agree that there were a lot of insights shared here. And I'm sure that, if, you know, if anyone has any questions, if you're open to it, Neil G, like in the future, if they can email you or reach out to you, we can maybe share your email if you're okay. If
Absolutely.
You're okay.
Absolutely. There's a Columbia email that you're welcome to share.
Okay. Amazing. Amazing. And so Vishwajit is saying here, if everyone here is comfortable just to turn on their cameras for just this one moment, we do want to take a screenshot so we can share with everyone. Yeah, Vishwajit, would you like to take the photo when everyone has their cameras on?
Sure. Yeah, I'm just waiting for a second.
Yeah.